He argues that the immoral behavior of Mao Zedong, Adolf Hitler, and Slobodan Milosevic has a genetic basis. She argues further that certain dysfunctional personality traits, such as narcissism, vindictiveness, and black and white thinking, are often found in politicians because these traits are advantageous in achieving political success. This event from Barnes & Noble Booksellers in Homestead, Pennsylvania, is an hour and 15 minutes.
To be here tonight. I think that probably I should start, seeing as how I was called a female Indiana Jones, maybe I should start with an Indiana Jones sort of story. When I was working in Antarctica, what I found was that, like everywhere, I always meet really interesting people, and it does seem that the odder the corner of the world, the more interesting the kind of people that you actually meet. These two people that I knew in Antarctica, one was named Art Brown. He was quite a character. He was enormous. He must have been 6'8". He looked, frankly, like a gorilla. And he spoke like one, too. He had this big, deep, booming voice. And his assistant was just a little guy, and kind of thin and wispy. He had a big head, so he looked like sort of an upside-down exclamation point. And he had a very slight voice, but Neil had one incredible talent. He could do imitations of almost anybody. He was an uncanny mimic. And what Neil liked to do, for kicks, he liked to pick up the phone at the station office and say, "Hello, this is Art Brown speaking," in a perfect imitation of Art Brown's voice. So one day he picks up the phone and says, "Hello, this is Art Brown speaking." And it was Art Brown on the other end of the line. So Neil says, so Art says, "Who the hell is this?" And Neil says, "Why, Art, this is you. I'm so glad you've finally gotten in touch with yourself." So that's actually what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to be talking about people who have a little bit of difficulty sometimes getting in touch with themselves. And also, we're going to learn something about ourselves and how we think about others and how we interact with others. So I think you'll find this maybe a rather interesting evening. I believe you've probably heard the name of my book. It is Evil Genes, Why Rome Fell, Hitler Rose, Enron Failed, and My Sister Stole My Mother's Boyfriend. And she really did steal my mother's boyfriend. So what's the story behind that? My mother had always wanted to go to Paris. And late in life, she met a man who wanted to make her dream come true. So she was really ecstatic. They were both rather elderly by that time. He was about 80. He was on oxygen tanks for his emphysema, but they planned to take those with them on the plane and go to Paris. So my mother at that time was living in Washington State, and my sister was living in Southern California. So my sister calls my mother one day and says, "You know, Mom, how's things going?" And my mom got all excited. "I'm going to Paris," right? So my sister immediately hangs up the phone, packs everything all up. Within a week, she'd moved up to Washington State to an apartment right next to my mother's, and coincidentally, right next to the man who was taking her to Paris. Well, she turned on a little of the charm. Doesn't take much, even though he's 40 years older than her. And next thing you know, she was on that plane to Paris. And then, as soon as she got back, of course, she dropped the guy like a hot rock. We all wonder, why do people do things like this? We've all encountered someone sooner or later where you say, what could they be thinking? How could they be so self-centered and so willing to hurt other people by doing something that they just feel like doing? It turns out, although we're often familiar with this kind of thing on a family level, it also happens on much broader scales. And an example of that might be someone like Slobodan Milosevic. Slobodan Milosevic was the dictator of Serbia. He had vast desires for gaining as much territory as he could, and so he fomented a lot of wars in the Balkans. And he was flown to Dayton, Ohio, where they were trying to talk him into, trying to make peace rather than war. And of course, you can see here, he's with his wife Mira, who he truly loved, and giving her a big hug. He's just coming back from the Dayton meetings, and he was feted as a peacemaker. He charmed the Americans, he charmed the Europeans, and everyone was totally convinced that he was just a pretty nice guy who was just misunderstood, and if they just played their cards right with him and did what he wanted, that peace would reign in the Balkans. Well, of course, that did not happen. In the end, he was responsible for the deaths of over 200,000 Bosnians. He also invaded the little sub-territory of Kosovo. And what he did there was really quite horrendous. If you look at this, this is actually a picture of the massacre of the village of Racek. This massacre took place about a half a mile from the home of the two young boys who we eventually were to adopt and who became our adopted sons. That massacre was what brought NATO into the war and brought us into fighting against Serbia. What they did was they just came into the village, took a bunch of the villagers out, and killed them. And they didn't just kill them nicely and cleanly. In many cases, they did some unseemly things to them before they died, and then after they died, they mutilated the bodies. I went to Kosovo and visited some of the relatives of our sons and asked them, well, as we were there, we were sitting, watching television. My sons were translating from the Albanian. And I was watching, and Slobodan Milosevic was on trial at that time at The Hague for some of his war crimes. And it turned out that on that particular day, in fact that week, they were interviewing him about what had happened at Racek. And he was asked, well, gee, if it was just a war, then how come these people were killed there? And he said, well, look, things like that happen in war. You get artillery barrages, people are killed, it's just the way things happen. And they said, well, if that's true, then how come some of the bodies were desecrated? How come this torture took place? And his answer was, I can't hear you. My earphones have cut off. Keep that in mind. I can't hear you, because that will take an important role later on in this lecture. So we wonder, and certainly in my case, I wondered, what is going on with people like my sister, like Slobodan Milosevic, these very different seeming people who did seem to have some of the same characteristics, especially in the nasty things that they would do to other people. I decided, wait a minute, now I do bioengineering research, I've got my PhD in a solid, scientifically grounded subject, I know how to do research, why don't I use some of those skills and go see what the literature tells us? So I went in. There's a science database called Medline, and it is pretty much the standard database if you're doing scientific research to look up what kind of studies have been done on people. So I decided to go to Medline and see what Medline said about nasty people. Well, first thing, when you're looking on something like this, Medline, what kind of search words do you use to look up nasty people? I mean, you can't type in nasty and see if somebody's done some kind of imaging study on nastiness or something like that. So I poked around and I looked around, and then the best thing I could seem to find as far as a term that people used for people like Slobodan Milosevic was the term malignant narcissism. He was a malignant narcissist. And indeed, if you go Google up malignant narcissist, you will find really, literally hundreds of thousands of references to that term on the web. There's a lot of psychological papers that are published on that phenomenon. And so I decided, oh, well, okay, I've got a good term for that phenomenon. I'll go take a look and see what the science literature says about it. So first I Googled up, or I didn't Google up, I went to Medline and I Medlined up antisocial personality disorder. There's like 5,000 or more studies, at least at that time. And talking good, solid scientific studies, you know, genetics, medical imaging, and so forth. Good studies. Looked at borderline personality disorder, that's another disorder, and there were about 3,000 studies. So then I Medlined up malignant narcissism. Do you know how many studies I found? Zero. Zero scientific studies on the term malignant narcissism. So here's a term that everybody's using all the time as if it actually meant something, and maybe it does mean something, but there's no scientific research upon which that term is actually based. So I thought, I think this is a little bit of a problem. So then I realized something else that was quite interesting. Psychology has done incredible research over the last 100 years. But what they've done is they've done research to categorize people who are really, really ill, right? They're clinically ill. What does it mean to be clinically ill? It means you are so sick, either mentally or physically, that you have somehow been brought in to a clinic or brought yourself into a clinic and you've been diagnosed as being ill with some disorder. But here's the trick. A lot of personality disorders, the very heart of the disorder is you cannot tell there's anything wrong with you. So you're not going to go into a clinic and say, hey, look, you know, I'm really sick. I'm a sadist, right? Treat me, right? It just doesn't happen. So a lot of the research has only been done on really, really ill people, right? Who are very easy to detect in that either they get dragged in there because of the court systems, dragged into a clinic, or they are at least well enough to recognize there is something wrong with themselves. And what that leaves is a whole class of people who are subclinically ill, right? Or they have subclinical little manifestations of disorder, but they're never really technically diagnosed with anyone as having any problem. So psychologists often look at that and say, well, look, you know, it's Slobodan Milosevic. He can't be ill. He's never been diagnosed with anything. Well, he hasn't. But it's clear that he did have some very real problems. So when I really started researching things, what I found was there were two sort of extremes of disorders that seem to have very similar traits to the kind of disorders of the people I was looking at, people like my sister or like Slobodan Milosevic. And the first of these is an illness or disorder called psychopathy. What's psychopathy? Well, the best example I can probably give you is of, this is a child psychopath. And what he would do, he was about 7 years old, and he would do things like this. He took the family cat and he hung it in the foyer. And then he positioned himself so that as his mother came in the door, he would be able to witness and enjoy the expression of horror on her face as she saw the cat hanging there. This child would do things like stick pins in the rug so that people would walk past and then get hurt as they were doing that. It was psychopathy is a horrendous disorder. It's something that where people have no empathy whatsoever for the people they're interacting with. They'll take advantage of you in a moment. They'll lie, cheat, steal. But here's the trick. They look just like you and me. They look perfectly normal. And so when we see someone who's a psychopath, we can often be fooled because they look so normal. But if you look inside their brain using the latest imaging techniques, you see some very different things going on. What you see is the part of the brain known as the limbic system, which is deep down within the brain and responsible for our emotions. It doesn't seem to be as active. It's kind of low functioning. And so other parts of the brain seem to be overactive. They think what's happening is it's a psychopath's way of trying to think their way into coping with reality using different mechanisms. So even though a psychopath may look as if they're deciding to do these awful things to people, in reality, if our brains were wired the way we were, theirs is, we may well find ourselves doing exactly the same thing. But there's another disorder. We talked about psychopathy. There's another disorder that's also very, very applicable to the kinds of things we're talking about here. And this disorder is called borderline personality disorder. Has anybody here heard of the term borderline personality disorder? Okay, some of you. First, I'd like to make it clear, as I'm just beginning to speak about this disorder, that people who have borderline personality disorder can do some really awful things. But here's the sad part. They often regret later, deeply regret what they've done. It's that borderline, people with this disorder don't have the emotional toolkit that they need to be able to handle interacting with others in a good fashion. And we'll see a little more of this later on. But what kinds of things do borderlines do? They might do something like this. They might, well, there's a term for one of the things they do called gaslighting. And you may ask me, well, what's gaslighting? Gaslighting is named this after a movie that was filmed in the 1940s, and it starred Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer. And in this movie, Ingrid played a wealthy heiress from the late 1800s, and what she was doing was her mother had died of a mental illness, and she was really afraid that she would have this illness too. She married a man who loved her very much, and then what happened was, of course, he turned out to be very much of a bad guy. And so what he tried to do was drive her insane. How could he do that? He would do things like this. He would climb up into the attic, and then he would play with the knob of the gas, right, that controlled the gas flow. Then he'd come back downstairs, sit down, and then what he'd do is, you know, later on, the gas would start fluctuating. The lamps would start fluctuating. And then she'd say, dear, did you see that? The lamp was fluctuating. And he'd say, oh, no, dear, are you feeling all right? Right? So what that meant was her sense of what was going on in reality was actually not verified, not validated by her husband. He would do this time after time. He would ask her where the keys were, and she'd say, I haven't seen it. And he'd say, oh, I'm sure you know, haven't you taken my keys? And, no, I didn't take, are you sure? And he'd look in her purse, and he'd find that she'd put the keys in her purse, right? Ostensibly stolen them, that kind of thing. And after a while, she really did think she was going crazy. But, of course, she wasn't. But we are left with that term of gaslighting. Gaslighting means somebody just does not validate what you know to be true. So what would be an example of something like that in your life? Okay, I'm here for a conference. let's say I go to a conference and Larry and I agree that we're going to meet tomorrow, and we're going to be meeting with Lisa. So Lisa calls me up and says, okay, Barb, I'm going to meet you and Larry tomorrow at the conference at the registrations office. And so Larry's standing right beside me. He hears Lisa say that, and we say, great. So we go over there. We make a special trip. We sit. We're waiting for Lisa. Waiting for Lisa. She never shows up. What's going on? We talk to Lisa later on. Lisa says, conference? I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I had to go do something else during that time. And unless Larry had, with Larry standing beside me and knowing he overheard her saying that, if that hadn't happened, I would be doubting myself. Did that really happen? You know, maybe Lisa's right. Maybe I'm kind of making that up. Maybe I misheard her somehow, right? So I'll bet you've experienced this sort of gaslighting situation. If it happens a little bit, oh, then you kind of go, oh, you know, maybe it's me. If it starts happening very often, after a while, you can literally become depressed because your sense of reality is not being validated. What other kinds of things can a person with borderline personality do? They will do things like black and white thinking. They may pick someone, and that person is just incredible. They're so terrific that, you know, they're on a pedestal, and you just think they're just wonderful. And they'll pick another person, and that person's horrible. Now, what did they actually do to receive this kind of treatment? Nothing, right? It's just, that's the way a person with this disorder thinks about things. And here's the really funny thing. This can go on for a day, a week, a month, years, and then all of a sudden it flip-flops, right? All of a sudden, yeah, you know, I thought you were really good, but it's all nothing. You are nothing to me. And all of a sudden I start treating you really nastily, and you suddenly become on a pedestal. And when you're on that pedestal, it feels really good. So it's sometimes difficult not to fall in love with someone with some of these traits, because when they adore you, they really adore you. And then you can't imagine what happened when suddenly you fall off the pedestal. It's like, has my wife or my husband suddenly become possessed? You know, they're acting so differently towards me now. But it's very much a function of the kind of erratic emotional structures that those with borderline personality can have. What other kinds of characteristics can they show? Here's probably one of the most important: narcissism. Narcissism, as it turns out, is, in a very well done genetic study, it turns out to be the most strongly heritable of all the personality traits. So it's a strongly heritable disorder. But also, it's something that you can clearly see the environment would also play a role in. I mean, if I was getting all of the adulation that Britney Spears was getting, I might also have a different sense of what my reality was than the sense that I do right now. But here's the thing that narcissism can really do. Think about it this way. Have you ever done something where it was for a good cause, right? You might have, like, kind of slanted the facts a little because it's for a good cause. Let's say you're doing a fundraiser and you want to talk somebody into coming to this fundraiser. So you sort of say, well, you know, it's not going to take very much of your time. Ha, lie number one. And there'll be all these really fun people there. Well, maybe it's not true, but you're going to say it. You will say pretty much anything you possibly can get away with saying, because you know it's really for a good cause. You're going to raise funds for some kids that really need it, maybe. So we all have done this kind of thing where we'll kind of shade facts or do something a little bit, just a little bit not quite truthful, just to help a good cause. But for a narcissist, they have built in within themselves the best of all possible causes, themselves, right? So what does that mean? That means they can lie, cheat, steal, kill somebody. Whatever it takes, they can do it because you know, it's really for a good cause. And they can justify really some very sad things because of that. So what other kinds of things? Here's another very interesting trait that those with borderline personality can have, and that is called situational competence. You can have someone who's a doctor, right? Very well esteemed in the community, highly respected, makes a lot of money, and they work very hard, and they do a good job at work, and they may even be well liked at work. And they come home, and they abuse their wife, and they abuse their kids, and their wife and their kids cannot do anything because no one would ever believe them if they tried to say something. I mean, this guy's a doctor, right? Remember the subclinical stuff. He's never been declared as having any kind of personality disorder, so he clearly can't be ill. So who's going to be believed? The doctor or the wife at home? On the other, putting the shoe on the other foot, you may have a wife at home who the husband wants to leave because she's really got a lot of these kinds of traits. What does she say to him? Honey, you leave me, I'm going to call you, I'm going to call the cops for child abuse. I'm going to tell them all about this stuff, and you know I'm so good, they'll believe me and they'll haul you off to jail. And it happens. It does happen. Because, and why is she doing this? Well, for a good cause, right? She has a little bit of narcissism, and she thinks she's the cat's meow, and so if he wants to hurt her, she can hit right back and hurt him in the best way she knows how, and emotionally is a very good way to attack someone. So here's all of these kinds of disorders that we've got the two major disorders and all the traits within them: psychopathy, borderline personality disorder. If you have one, psychopathy, you're pretty dysfunctional, and you can probably end up in jail just because hopefully people will catch on to what you're doing. Borderline personality disorder is another very serious disorder, but it's a sad one because, as I said, often these people really regret later on the kinds of emotional outbursts that they've had. What happens if you have someone with a combination of those traits? You have someone who is manipulative, duplicitous, deceitful. They'll do pretty much anything they want for themselves, and no remorse, right? They'll do whatever. So if you have that kind of inflammatory mixture of the two disorders, you are really asking for trouble. You're asking for someone like Adolf Hitler, right? But you might say, look, come on now. Adolf Hitler is not like my sister, right? Or like some other nasty character I know. It couldn't be, because he killed millions, but, you know, my brother didn't kill anybody. He's just a really obnoxious character. What's the difference between those two? Here's the difference. You need to have a few extra little traits to rise really high in the social structure. One of those traits is you want to look really good, right? If you look pretty handsome, if you look good, that's a trait that can be very helpful. Another one is, of course, charm. If you're witty and funny and can kind of play different roles for different people, that works very well. But the most important one is probably something that's not very obvious, and that is a very good memory. If you have a good memory, you can use that as a really good tool to climb very high in a social structure. How do I mean? Let's take Hitler. Hitler had an unbelievably good memory. He could remember the number on his bicycle from when he was like 6 years old. He could remember all of the names of the officers in all of his different divisions and all of their decorations, all the munitions. He had a memory that was so prodigious that he could instantly silence virtually anyone who tried to argue with him. If his generals came up and said, look, you can't be doing this is insane, he'd say, can you name all of the officers in all of your divisions? Can you name all of their decoration? Can you name all the different armaments? And of course they couldn't. So he would say, well then, how can you possibly criticize me? It's not as if having an exceptional memory makes you really intelligent, as some of Hitler's decisions really show. Mussolini also had a fabulous memory. He could walk up, he could pick up a book on his way in to give a talk, he'd take a glance at a page just like this, close it, come back, get up on the podium, and quote verbatim from that book as if he had read the whole thing and understood it. And in reality, he didn't know anything about it. But he could fake it really, really well. So having a great memory is an incredible boon for leaders of all sorts. Who else had great memory? Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had an unbelievably good memory. Bill Clinton, I go to the Clinton Library, I see one of the docents there and just ask her, how is Clinton's memory? She like rears back and says, you know, I met him only once, 5 years before, and he saw me again. He asked me, he remembered my name, he asks how my husband is doing, he remembered everything about the whole time, and that was one instance 5 years before. So he had an uncanny memory. Having a really good memory helps you to rise to the top of any social structure. But if it's embedded in a good person, it can be used for good purposes. If it's embedded in someone who's more narcissistically oriented with some of these other real problems, then you can end up having someone rise to the top who you would never want rise to the top. Once they get to the top, they can rewrite the rules. And the rules then are not pleasant at all. So I think that it's probably the most important thing to remember is that there's incredible discoveries being made now in our understanding of not only the brain, but also our genetics. We're really beginning to understand how people have neurological underpinnings, sometimes helped by genetics, that can help flavor how they view the world and how they interact with the world. Now, people often say, they say, oh, okay, you're going to talk about genetics and genetics shaping personality. It is absolutely true that genetics shapes every factor of our personality, but environment shapes it equally. It's pretty much a 50-50 equation. I mean, we've got genetics, we've got environment, but here's the funny thing. You can't say in any one person that that one person is 50-50 shaped by environment and personality. It's only on big averages that you see this. And what I mean is this. If you have, let's take the Romanian orphans. Ceausescu was a dictator during the 1980s, and he did not allow for abortion in Romania. As a consequence, tens of thousands of children were born who were abandoned in orphanages. These kids, there were so many of them that the orphanages were overwhelmed and they didn't have enough people to care for them, and so what they did was they just stick a bottle in a kid's mouth, and then they come and get the bottle out, and what did that mean? The kid never got any hugs, never got any love, never got any attention. And so these kids, as it turns out, grew up to have deep, deep psychological problems, and there really isn't anything that we can do to fix that once they start to mature. In that particular case, environment overrode genes. Environment overrode everything. Genes really didn't matter. If you had good genes, bad genes, who cares what kind of genes? You didn't have a chance because the environment didn't give you that chance. On the other side of the spectrum, however, you have something like this. Researcher Essie Viding at the King's College in London has done research on twins. And what she has found is that if one twin has very strong traits of psychopathy, the other twin, if it is identical, will very, very likely have these same psychopathic-like traits. But if the other twin is, fraternal, then what you'll see is they might have some psychopathic traits, maybe not. It's more like just typical siblings, or, you know, they might be alike, they might not be alike. There's nowhere near the strong correlation as when you have identical twins. So that indicates that genetics can play a strong role in at least some types of psychopathy. And in this particular case, it really doesn't matter so much what the environment was, because in this case, genes overrode everything. I guess I'd like to bring up the idea of how our brains can really shape how we think about things. And in this particular case, I'd like to show you, if you have two different types of genes for serotonin transporters, there's the long genotype and there's the short genotype. And if you don't know anything about neuroscience, don't even worry. I'll explain everything you need to know. There's two key parts of the brain that we're going to talk about here. One is the amygdala. That's the fight or flight center of your brain that's deep down your brain. So if I go, boo, and you actually start a little bit, which you didn't, of course, then what's happening is it's the amygdala getting that signal and saying, oh, I'm startled. And then what happens is you send a signal up to the anterior cingulate cortex, and that signal gets up to, that's where you think about it. You become aware of, oh, wait a minute, you know, that's just Barb going boo. And so you calm back down, right? So you send a signal, you calm back down, and everything is hunky-dory. But then what happens on somebody who has not so many serotonin transporters? What that does is that doesn't give you as good a signal that you can send. And so when I say boo, or if the airplane starts shaking, or if for some reason I get really quite nervous, I send a little signal up to my conscious brain, but it's not very big. I can't really do very much with it. You know, it's like, I'm just scared. I just know I'm scared. And you can't calm yourself back down. And so then this person really gets quite upset. And they seem to get really fly off the handle, and they can't really control themselves. Is it because they're consciously deciding to be that way? Well, not really. They're predisposed to thinking that way. You can make some tweaks. In fact, there's enormous plasticity we have in being able to change our brain. But remember, some people with personality disorders don't realize there's anything wrong with them. Another trait that I didn't really talk about in borderline personality disorder is something called projection. I don't have anything wrong with me. It's you guys who all have the problem, right? So if I have these kinds of traits, I'm not going to try and make conscious efforts to change how my brain is thinking about things, because I think I'm doing okay. Here's another kind of thing that borderlines will do. Put this back down. They will, well, what's going on here? This is, imagine that somebody looks at a picture of roadkill. You know it's just a picture, okay? A normal person, here is a normal person's reaction to roadkill. Think, I mean, there's just nothing going on there, right? It's just, yeah, it's roadkill. Oh, yuck. A person with borderline personality disorder looks at that same picture and look at what happens to them. Wow, they really get upset about this kind of thing. And it's pre-wired in them to get more upset. And also what they can do is they can have a sort of a negative perspective when they're looking at people. I can look at Fred, and Fred looks happy, right? But I could perceive that as possibly questionable. In fact, I could perceive that as possibly something dangerous for me. So I could be looking and kind of catching a glimpse of Fred out of the corner of my eyes and thinking to myself, you know, Fred's not smiling there. He's actually kind of looking at me like, I know he's planning something. And and this keeps going around. I can't eradicate that thought. You know, it's all blown up here. I've got high metabolism, and I'm simplifying quite a bit. But this is the general idea of what's going on. Suddenly, I erupt. I call Fred nasty words and really do horrible things that I deeply regret later because I don't have the emotional toolkit to handle, and I'm predisposed to think about things in a way that can set me up to be very touchy, right? So you're always walking on eggshells around me. Now, I think one thing that has become very clear in this talk is simply the idea that we all have this sort of neurological wiring that makes it so we have, I'm not saying we don't have free will, and there's a lot of philosophers who've gone way into depth on this, and there's the whole question of what is free will. But it does seem that some people have more free will than others, at least in the way that I sense free will, or I define free will. And you can give, probably the best analogy for this is something like this. Let's say I'm a basketball player. I'm really tall, right? Now get the little brother who grows up and he's only, you know, 5'11". Is he ever going to be a basketball player? He can do a lot. He can really change and emphasize his skills and improve them. But there's only so far that his free will can carry him. He's not going to be able to grow himself to 6'5" or 6'8". It's just not there. It's not in the genes. So we each have some degree of free will, but it does seem to be a little bit lower than you might expect, on some occasions at least. Let me show you a picture of a little girl. This little girl is my sister. This was taken when she was about 3 years old, and about 60 years ago. 3 weeks after this picture was taken, she was in an iron lung, fighting for her life. She could not even breathe. Why? Well, it turns out that she had been afflicted with polio. She was among the last cohort of children to have polio. And polio, as it turns out, always damages an area of the brain known as the reticular formation. So that area, as it turns out, is responsible for our ability to pay attention. Remember, I was saying we're going to allude to paying attention. And so she would do things like this. I remember, well, when she was about 22, she ran away from home. And she was gone for about 10 years. My parents were utterly devastated. They had always tried to do whatever they could to help her. And so what they found was, well, after 10 years, they tried to search for her, but at that time there was no internet, and it's pretty hard to search for someone who's an adult and who chooses to do this. And after 10 years, though, one day she suddenly calls my father up and says, "Oh, I want to rejoin the family." My father was ecstatic. My parents were thrilled. They immediately sent her the money so she could come and rejoin us. What did she do? She spent the money on something else. So my father, who was a very giving soul, immediately sent her some more money, and she spent that on something else. And so he finally got wise and said, you know, I'll send her a plane ticket. So you sent her a plane ticket, and here she comes. And I remember her coming up. She gave me a big hug. She gave everybody a big hug. "Oh, I'm so glad to be back. And I love you so much, and I'm sorry about what's happened." And you're like on the fence. You know, does she really mean it? You know, is she putting it on? You know, maybe she really does mean it. And there's this secret part of you that's really so hopeful. And so she and I sat together for about an hour. And then after an hour, she excused herself to go down to the store. And she met a man there and moved in with him. And I didn't see her for another 5 years. And you ask yourself, how could someone do something like this? But remember, her attentional mechanism was not working properly. I wasn't standing in front of her when she was standing with that man in the store. He was standing in front of her. So that's who she focused on. And that kind of thing is the kind of thing that we often don't think of. We think, oh, she's consciously deciding to do these things. No, in all probability, some of the neurological damage that was affiliated with the polio is what led her to act the way she did. Does everyone with polio act that way? Hardly, not at all. It's that some people are able to recover their attentional abilities. Others can have much more problem with that kind of thing. What is polio? Polio is the perfect example of how both genetics and environment can intertwine to make deep effects in our personality. Because she could never have even caught polio if her genes hadn't allowed it. If you get polio, it's only because you have the particular types of receptors that allow polio to get into your neurons. She did. And so did many of my cousins. Polio does run in families. So ultimately then, I think it's very important to remember something that Gavin de Becker once said, and that is that we all are prone to one of the ego's evil little lies, and that is all our actions are decided by us. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much to Barnes & Noble here for inviting me, and to Fred Bortz, and I really can't thank the Center for Inquiry enough to invite me out here. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have. Okay.
Do you think the prevalence of evil genes in the human population is at an equilibrium? And can some of them be advantageous, maybe for small human groups?
Okay. So that's a very good question. One thing I haven't really talked about is the fact that probably thousands of genes affect every one of our personality traits. So there's absolutely no way that you could go in and like eliminate a couple evil genes and voila, the evil is gone from the population. And in fact, some of the genes that seem to make for some of our most evil personality traits are actually genes that are, you mix them with other genes and suddenly you have really terrific personality traits. You may be more intelligent or even more compassionate. It just depends on sort of the random assortment of genes and how they come together. Of course, we all know intuitively, if you're willing to cheat, you can get ahead. That's the way it works. People with some of these makeups that they're more easily able to lie or to manipulate and deceive, obviously these are individuals who can get to the top. As my husband has said, both the cream and the scum can rise to the top. So there's two different ways to do it. One is to be really, really good at what you do, and one's to be willing to cheat at what you do. So you can see both types as they rise. On an evolutionary basis, it's hard to say. Since the agricultural revolution 10,000, 6,000 years ago, populations have exploded. In a high population, the more dense a population area, the easier it is for someone like a psychopath to hide, right? In fact, they found that cities seem to attract people with psychopathic-like traits. Why? You can go there, nobody knows you, you can fool them long enough to get whatever you want to get, you're out of there, and you can quickly and easily find a new crew to go go mingle with and work your wiles on. Also, more than that, at least during the time of the agricultural revolution, where there grew to be large population centers, if you were a despot and you were willing to do pretty much anything you wanted to anybody, you could climb to the top of the heap, and then also you could get all the girls. So what is it? Some enormous percentage, something like 2% of the world's population are descendants of Genghis Khan, direct male descendants of Genghis Khan. I mean, Queen Elizabeth is thought to have some ancestry from Genghis Khan. So, I mean, you can really get ahead if you are willing to kind of slant the rules. Does that mean we should be doing it? No. I think what it means is we do need to be aware of what's going on. Ultimately, I really do think of Evil Genes as being a tremendously empowering book. Why? Because if you know that some people can't help what they're doing, then what that means is you don't take things quite so personally anymore. Somebody can be really nasty to you, and if you're just kind of mentally sitting back and saying, you know, they're doing what they're wired to do. It's not something that, you know, I should be taking personally. I don't need to jump in and interact with them, you know, on and kind of climb into their emotional world. This is what they need to do, and kind of from a Zen perspective, I can't change them. I literally cannot change their wiring. I can only change my own wiring. I can only change myself and my reaction to people. So reading this book is, I think, can be very liberating. Helps us choose our friends, helps us avoid the pitfalls of history, and so I think it can be very helpful to know about this kind of thing.
From what you said, it sounds like the psychopaths are easy to recognize, but that the borderline personality is harder to detect. Is there any way to detect it? Is there any diagnostic tools or criteria for identifying it?
Well, there are tests and so forth, but remember, you can game the test pretty easily. So if you do not want to be caught, most people who are not egregiously ill with borderline personality disorder, they can easily evade detection. And then there's always the question of when are they really ill and when are they. It's a very fine line, and neurologically speaking, it's a very fine line. In fact, right now, we don't have the capability. We know that their brains react very differently, and we have some crude idea of what's going on. Well, we certainly don't know enough yet to put somebody in an imaging machine and say, oh yeah, you've got borderline personality disorder. And it may well be many years, and it should be, before we feel comfortable that we know enough about mental circuitry to really understand what's going on.
Something you didn't talk about tonight, but I know from reading the book, you have chapters about Mao Zedong and Milosevic. You've talked a bit about Milosevic. But we're seeing something in the news right now about another leader. And I wonder if you would comment on Robert Mugabe and what is happening in Africa. I watch in amazement that this guy continues to get away with what he's doing. And now he's going to be reelected to be the president of Zimbabwe.
The horrific thing when you have someone like this who's in leadership, it's deucedly difficult to get rid of them, because they own all the political machinery. So they can get people to vote the way they want them to vote. And in fact, there's a very clever setup usually of, there can be carrots, little rewards for people who cooperate with what you want to do, and then other things to do if you do not cooperate. For example, if you're not going to be cooperating, we won't kill you, we won't do a thing to you. Well, just torture your family to death. Is that going to silence people? Absolutely. Mugabe is the perfect example of someone who, he was a very, very gifted student. He won scholarships and a lot of support because he's a highly intelligent individual. But again, you could even see early on in some of the kinds of things he was willing to do, the means he would use to justify his ends were enough that, I mean, you could see a lot of those kinds of traits. But it's difficult. How can you get in and stop someone from doing something like that? It's, as we all know, it's very problematic to go into another country and try to tell them how to run their political structure. So sometimes all you can do is just gasp and say, this is horrific. But on the other hand, sometimes there's more we can do than that. They found that genocide, in particular, happens. One of the main reasons that genocide can happen is people do not believe that other human beings are capable of such atrocities. And so often people just don't react to what's going on in, you know, Rwanda or with Mugabe because they simply don't believe that anyone could really be that bad. And then the fact of the matter is most people are pretty good people. But you can be led by a very self-serving, malevolent sort into doing things that you would normally never believe to do or think to do. And so that's why sometimes you can find masses of very good people who do some real atrocities. They're often led into it by people with no empathy and people who are willing to do anything to anybody to get to where they want to be, which is a position of power and control, like Mugabe. And then it's very, very sad. So right now what's unfolding is extremely regretful, and I think the important thing to recognize is people like him are not someone that you can go and negotiate honestly with, just as you could not negotiate honestly with Milosevic.
If somebody has psychopathy or borderline personality disorder, and it's causing harm to themselves or to their families, loved ones, other people, is there anything that they themselves can do to recognize it and to change themselves and go out for help before things get worse?
What a great question. The short answer is no. There's nothing to be done. The longer answer is sometimes people can, particularly with borderlines, they can be brought to a place where they really do love other people, right? You saw how Milosevic really loved his wife. If sometimes they can be brought to a point where they can start to catch a glimpse that, yes, there is something going on here. Maybe it is with me a little bit, I'm not really sure, but if that happens, then therapy can start to make a little bit of an effect. Marsha Linehan in Seattle is doing some therapeutic programs with borderlines that is actually quite interesting and quite beneficial. I would highly recommend the books that are authored or co-authored by Randy Krager. That's Kreger. She wrote Stop Walking on Eggshells. She co-authored that book, and she has a new one coming out. I believe it is The Family Guide to Borderline Personality Disorder. In that particular book, what she talks about is what can you do if somebody you know and love has this disorder? And she gives you concrete tools for how to interact with that person so that it helps both you and that person to calm down and act more intelligently. So I highly recommend her books.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you'd talk a little bit about some of the particular studies you read about the interaction of genes and personalities. So you said you searched Medline and there was some work in genetics on that. So would you talk about just a particular case where there's that connection between the two?
Okay. For example, it's almost hard to narrow things down a little bit. But bipolar disorder is thought to have some strong genetic components. I'm not as cognizant of what's going on there because, of course, I haven't been. Another is schizophrenia. It seems that schizophrenia has perhaps dozens of genes. Each one can help predispose you. So the more you get, the more chance you have of getting it. But it does not mean that you're going to get it. Again, just like with schizophrenia, it's very similar to the position of, or the condition of polio, in that if you have someone who has schizophrenia and they have an identical twin, the identical twin only has a 50% chance of having schizophrenia. So you go, is it genetic or is it not genetic? It turns out you can get a lot of genes that can get you just predisposed. And they're beginning to think that some exposure to an environmental virus or toxin of some sort may be the final kicker that people need to go into full-blown schizophrenia. And of course, with schizophrenia, some of the aspects of schizophrenia are highly creative thinking. And so having a predisposition for it, but not actually having the disorder, can actually be beneficial, their thinking, because it can help you think more creatively and more intelligently about some sorts of things. For borderline personality disorder, serotonin seems to play a role, and there's transporter and receptors that are coded for by our genetics. Dopamine and other neurotransmitters are also, there's enzymes that help metabolize all of these kinds of things. It's quite complex, but they're all coded for by our genes. And at any part of the process, you can have lots of genes that can help influence your susceptibility to the disorder. Does it mean if you have the genetics for borderline personality disorder that you're going to get it? No. But you can have a really strong biological underpinning so that chances are really good you're going to get it, or you can have a little weak dose and you can be abused as a child, and that can help bring on the disorder, the abuse. So both genes and environment, again, are really important.
Would you mind to comment on your personal definition of free will?
Oh, that's such a tough question. I was hoping you would ask me something easy, like what is evil? Free will, as I take it, is probably the standard definition, dictionary definition of I at least have the semblance of thinking that I, myself, am making a personal choice about what to be doing, right? So that it's not pre-programmed, that I'm not deciding something, but then it's actually just the way that my genes are, and everything, part of my body is deterministically telling me to think. I do think we have some kind of free choice, but that's my feeling. Am I certain about that? No. And in fact, certainty is a whole nother area of, some people can have pathological certainty, right, because of their circuitry, and some people can have pathological uncertainty. And so that degree of what's pathological uncertainty, that would be somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder who cannot be sure. Even when they're looking at the stove, they turn away and they're not sure that they turned it off. But at any rate, this certainty, I think, plays a role, and I think it will probably play a strong role in my next book. So, any more questions?
Wasn't he a psychologist or a psychiatrist?
Actually, no, not that I know of. I'm trying to remember what he did study. His wife was ostensibly a scientist, but she had, she got her degrees and like she would be accused of cheating on tests and so forth, but no one could do anything about it because her husband was quite powerful. I believe that he was in something to do with politics, but I can't really quite remember what he did study.
I read somewhere that he was either a medical doctor or a psychologist, and I said, how could someone in the medical field be so evil, you know, and do so many bad things?
Oh, Well, that's a very good question. How can someone be so evil and be a trained medical doctor? If you look at someone like Joseph Mengele in Auschwitz, he was, if you look at what happened to him, you think, oh, this person is the personification of evil. He was the man who stood there and said, you live, you die, you're a set of twins, I'm going to torture one of you for my own pleasure, in essence. And this was a trained medical doctor. And you say, how could this be? The interesting thing is Mengele, when he took off to South America and lived free for the rest of his life, as free as you can be when you're on the run, what was he? He's just a nasty man. He was really nasty to his son. He was nasty to the people he was around. Just basically a nasty guy. But when he didn't have the mechanism of being at the top of a concentration camp, he was just sort of normal Joe Blow. All he could be was nasty. And that's indeed what he was. He had very much of these. So you can, as I said, you can be a doctor, you can be very highly placed, and you can still have many of these very malevolent traits.
Why is it so difficult for males and females to get along, and why do one think the other is the evil flirting?
I'm really glad you asked that, because here's the bottom line. The kinds of traits that I'm talking about here are really found equally in both males and females. Females are more often diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Males are more often diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. But they're actually a spectrum of pretty much the same kind of behavior. Males just have a little bit more violence, right? If you want to look at who commits the most child abuse, who is it? It's women. Women are the ones who are around children the most often. We don't usually hear that kind of thing. But of course, and some studies have shown that it's equal rates for spousal abuse between men and women. We only hear about the women. It's actually both. So sometimes it's easy to say, oh, it's the women who have all these problems, or conversely, if you're a woman, to say, it's the men who have all these problems. No, it's just a small subset, and you're probably homing in on that subset if you seem to frequently encounter them, because there are far, far more perfectly normal, perfectly wonderful people. So just be a little sensitive to if the person, whether the person that you're thinking to go out with may have another side that they're not really showing you. If you, especially if they're treating you really, really nicely so that you know you're on a pedestal. Any other questions? You have been, oh yes.
Is there any evidence that religious belief affects a predisposition in bad behavior, either one way or the other?
Okay. To my knowledge, religious belief has absolutely no effect whatsoever on whether a person has these kinds of traits. If you have these traits, part of what goes with the territory is you want power and control. So what are you going to do? Whatever social structure you happen to end up in, that's the one that you're going to go start climbing in. If it happens to be a religion, you're going to start climbing up in the religion, and if you get very high, you can rewrite the rules, and it can be pretty nasty. But likewise, if it's in politics, I've lived in the Soviet Union, I know. It's an absolute 100% atheist philosophy. They take great pride in it, and it's really a cruddy political ideology. I mean, it makes it very, very hard on the people who have to live under that structure. Why? Because there's no checks and balances. Checks and balances, any kind of political, business, social structure that has checks and balances, you're able to shed a little sunshine on these kinds of individuals and expose them for the kinds of duplicity that they're trying to get across to you or fool you with. So really, the only thing I can say is you will always find a small percentage like this. The higher you climb in a social structure, the more likely you're going to find these people, because they're going to push themselves to climb high and get more power. And whatever that social structure is, you will find a surprising number. So if whatever political party you are, people they truly believe that their political party is better. But if you look at those political parties, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, whatever you are, you will find equal numbers of equally sinister and self-serving individuals in those parties.
Another question. You found that there's evil genes. Have you found good genes?
Yes.
You know, like I'm thinking of the altruistic persons that have been throughout history. What makes them so wonderful and good? Thinking of the other person, giving up their own lives to help another person.
That's actually the topic of my next book. But of course I had to put my own little twist on it, so it'll be, I think, a little bit more interesting than that, just nice people. But it's actually fascinating in that they've found a very recent gene related to vasopressin, which is one of our natural neurotransmitters. Some people can have basically the genetics that can predispose you to having a lot of vasopressin, and these people are really nice. They're like, you know, oh, you beat me last night? Oh, that's okay. No, I'm not going to call the cops. No, I'm not going to turn you in. If you have very little of the vasopressin, you're ruthless. You're very ruthless. And so, you know, it's this one gene, but of course there's so many other genes that can also play a role. They found that serotonin seems to play an effect on how hostile you get or how nice you can feel. They give people medication that can make your serotonin levels plummet, and you get really nasty, cranky, you know, and but you build them all up, and then you can be really nice. Oxytocin, there's a lot of interesting thing going on with that particular neurotransmitter, because it can make you feel like you love somebody. So there's the potential for some very interesting things to happen with that. So, and that's the hormone affiliated with birth. So when you pick up that baby and you love your baby, that's actually resulting from oxytocin. And so, yes, there are definitely some genes that can make people feel, or make people very altruistic, and sometimes overly altruistic, so that they'll take grief that normal people shouldn't take. But other individuals, there are so many great human beings that, for I bet, a variety of genetics and environmental influences have done so much for us, their descendants, and the people we know, that it makes me proud to be a member of the human race.
Heading back to where this seems to be going, I once heard a panel discussion that asked the question, what distinguished the people who helped the Jews in Nazi Germany from those who didn't? And one of the panelists, who was, I think, a theologian professor at Duquesne University, said that she had studied this, and the one thing that they discovered was that the people who helped had a well-developed, internalized sense of morality. Does your work, either in this book or the next book that you have anything to say on this subject?
There's actually a great deal that's beginning to come out now on that natural sense of altruism. It does seem that unless you are on that small extreme of people who are wired differently, most everybody has a basic sense of decency, of compassion for other people. It's pretty tough to teach somebody to kill. Right? And even when you're brought up to believe that a particular group of human beings is worse than dogs, as the Japanese were taught to believe before World War II about the Chinese, it was still tough to teach them to wantonly kill. And that's because we have a natural set of wiring that does care about other people. There's a natural sense of altruism that is within us. But once you break through that barrier, you can start using different neural circuits, at least as far as what I'm thinking, and you can be taught to kill, and even to enjoy it and think that it's a competitive sort of thing, and you might want to, you know, try and outdo the other person with how many that you can kill. So yes, there is something very basically decent, I think, about most human beings.
When my kids would bring girlfriends and boyfriends home, they would often accuse the mother and me of mapping their genome. Don't you think it's just a matter of time until we select mates, or certainly select children, by their genes?
I think that there are a lot of things that we can do with science. Anytime you have a new technology, you can do bad things with it. Did you know that when people first started to write, they started putting symbols onto clay, that there were people who actually objected to this and said it was a very bad idea because why? You don't get as good a memory. If you're using these little tools to help you remember things, your memory is not going to be as developed. That's a really good reason not to want to learn to write. But still, we did learn to use that tool, and it actually is remarkable. So I think with almost every tool that we develop as human beings, it's part of our nature to develop these new tools. Can they always be used for bad things? Well, sometimes they can be used for something that is bad. But I would hope that we would set up methods in place so that some kind of thing like that doesn't happen. And I should expect, as I said, most people really are pretty decent. I can't imagine most parents saying, you know, I want a genome of your boyfriend, potential mate, and actually being able to get access to it, for one thing. And I would hope it would never happen. But I do think that it's so important to understand what science is really telling us about humanity, that we don't really want to turn a blind eye because we're afraid of a possible problem. I think that way lays danger. So them's my thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Oakley. I want to thank you all for attending.
Barbara Oakley is a retired captain in the U.S. Army. She worked as a translator on Soviet trawlers in the Bering Sea and served as a radio operator at the South Pole Station in Antarctica. For more information on this book, visit the publisher at